EMDR is a very popular treatment option for pretty much everything at this point, though it began as a treatment for trauma. You're probably seeing it everywhere and have been, and there's a good chance you've worked with a therapist who uses EMDR. When most people think of EMDR, they picture a therapist waving a finger in front of someone's face, and that's it. That image has become shorthand. This shorthand image causes a lot of confusion when it comes to accurately assessing what's actually helpful about EMDR. So, in this episode, I'm going to look at what EMDR is beyond the eye movements. Also, I'll look into whether or not EMDR is helpful based on research. And, even more interestingly, what research says about what's helpful about EMDR. If you're new to the podcast, hi, I'm Justin Sunseri. I am a therapist licensed in California, and I've been practicing for about 17 years with a wide range of demographics, populations. I primarily use a blend of very present moment focused, body based, and solution oriented techniques. I also run the Unstucking Academy. It's a small private community for those who love what I do here on the podcast and are ready to take their self regulation efforts to the next level. I'll have links to the Unstucking Academy and everything that I discuss here in this episode in the description. Okay, so the first thing is we need to understand what EMDR actually is. This is going to change how you hear everything that comes after this first piece. And to do that, we will look briefly at the 8-phase structure of EMDR. Phase 1 includes history taking and treatment planning. The therapist gathers context, identifies target memories, and judges whether the person is ready to begin trauma processing. Phase 2 is preparation and stabilization. The therapist explains the EMDR process, builds rapport, and teaches the client grounding skills and ways to manage when things get intense, which they very likely will, just due to the nature of talking about traumas. Phase 3, or traumatic incidents. Phase 3 is assessment. Here, the therapist and the client activate a specific memory and identify the components, the image, the negative belief attached to it, the positive belief the client wants instead, the emotions, and the bodily sensations. They measure the distress and the believability of the new belief using baselines before processing starts. Phase 4 is desensitization. This is the one almost everyone thinks of when they hear EMDR. In this phase, the client holds the target memory in mind while following a bilateral stimulation of some sort, and the therapist continues the bilateral stimulation until the distress reduces. Phase 5 is installation, where the therapist again uses bilateral stimulation to strengthen a new adaptive belief. Phase 6 is the body scan. The client holds the memory and the new adaptive belief and then scans the body for any residual tension. If tension shows up, additional processing can follow. Phase 7 is closure. Sessions end with containment strategies and a return to baseline, so the client leaves feeling stable, whether or not the processing was completed. And finally, phase 8 is reevaluation. At the next session, you check whether, or the therapist checks whether the gains are held, whether the target is still processed, and whether new targets need attention. So notice where bilateral stimulation shows up. It's mainly in phases 4, 5, and if needed, 6. That means the eye movements or taps or sounds or whatever are a part of the process, but they're not the whole therapy. When viewed as a cohesive whole, the vast majority of EMDR is not very special. Once you remove the bilateral stimulation component, it involves assessing and treatment planning, rapport building, managing distress, questioning beliefs and thinking, thought replacement, bodily awareness, discussing past traumatic incidents, reevaluating, and making new goals. All of these pieces are fairly typical therapy components. If you ask any therapist if they do any of these pieces, they will probably say yeah. And they'll probably say that they do many of these pieces in some combination, likely all of them. So, does EMDR work? The short, evidence based answer is yes. Multiple organizations have recognized EMDR as an effective treatment for PTSD. The American Psychological Association, the APA, includes it among evidence based options. Well, sort of. There's a caveat there. They list it as a second tier option. The APA says it's more helpful than being on a wait list and more helpful than treatment as usual. And that the pros of EMDR outweigh the cons, or the cons of, I guess, not undergoing anything at all. Basically, well, it's better than standing around and doing nothing, and probably better than very basic talk therapy. So that's kind of something. The World Health Organization lists EMDR as a standard, and the United States Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Defense give EMDR a strong recommendation. In randomized trials, EMDR consistently outperforms waitlist controls and non-specific treatments, which is important, but again, it doesn't really tell us very much beyond the fact that the protocol does more than the passage of time or simple attention. People get better, and evidence shows that EMDR helps them get better. So that's important. But that's only half the question, really. When researchers compare EMDR to other trauma focused therapies like cognitive processing therapy or trauma focused CBT or prolonged exposure, the outcomes are, broadly speaking, similar. Direct comparisons amongst these tend to show equivalent reductions in PTSD symptoms. That pattern shows up across multiple trials and meta analyses. So, what does that tell us? It suggests EMDR is an effective and effective, to make sure that was clear, and effective path to healing, but not necessarily a unique one. Different roads can lead to the same place, basically. So let's talk about what those shared roads look like. In psychotherapy research, common factors emerge, elements that appear across different therapies and explain much of why they work. For trauma therapies, these common factors are maybe especially relevant. So the first one, I'm going to give you four. The first one is the therapeutic alliance. The relationship between therapist and client is a major predictor of positive outcomes across almost every form of therapy. I would say every form of therapy, actually. That bond, the therapist's empathy, the attunement, the ability to repair ruptures, these create predictability and a safe other to heal with. This co-regulation process from therapist to client creates a platform for safety, and it'll even activate the body's ventral vagal pathways, which are responsible for many cognitive, social, and health benefits when active. When active, then the therapy techniques are useful. So when in safety, then techniques become useful, whether that's challenging false beliefs or telling the trauma narrative. So that's the first one. Number two is exposure. Processing a traumatic memory by holding it in mind while staying present is exposure. In EMDR, the client activates the memory and stays with it during desensitization. In prolonged exposure, the person repeatedly recounts the narrative. Trauma-focused CBT has the client tell the narrative repeatedly as well. The formats differ, but all of these involve confronting the memory rather than avoiding it. Exposure allows the brain and the body to relearn that the memory is a memory and not a current threat. The recovery process of exposure is also extremely important. Is important, but I would say extremely important. The system learns that it can access discomfort, whether through a memory or something else. It can access discomfort and then recover from it. Repeatedly doing so builds the body's distress tolerance. Third is expectancy and hope. Belief that the therapy will work matters. Positive expectations is mobilizing. Somebody with hope is more likely to take action and maximize their therapy time, no matter what style the therapist is using. Simply having hope is big, and having hope with a safe other is even bigger. And number four, the last one is cognitive reprocessing. Most therapies involve some level of questioning thoughts, whether through reframing them or reality testing or something else. Many clients of mine actually, they will explicitly tell me or ask me to call them out on their thinking. Like if they're avoiding things through making excuses or rationalizing their pain or minimizing it. People want to have clearer thinking. They want to be called out on it. These elements and more show up across various therapies. They are not unique to EMDR. They account for a large share of positive outcomes, regardless of the modality a therapist uses. So we have addressed whether or not EMDR is effective. But there's a much more interesting question we need to ask. Do the eye movements or other forms of bilateral stimulation matter? Is that the active ingredient that makes EMDR special, or is it just an accessory on top of the things that actually work? People have tried to answer this question with dismantling studies. These are clinical trials that compare full EMDR with versions that remove the bilateral stimulation or put other controls in place of the bilateral stimulation. And research trials have found that EMDR with and without eye movements found no significant difference in PTSD symptoms. A meta-analysis of several dismantling studies found no statistically significant advantage for bilateral stimulation. But there was another meta-analysis that found a moderate benefit to eye movements in lab-based studies, but this benefit was inconsistent in clinical PTSD trials. So a benefit in the lab, but not so much outside the lab. You're wondering, but Justin, why would lab results be different than clinical trials? Well, many potential reasons. In lab studies, everyone is on their best behavior. They're following protocols. They know they're being monitored, maybe evaluated, and therefore they provide the best possible treatment that they can. In controlled trials, therapists are also more likely to be trained for the study and supervised, unlike the real clinical world. On top of where therapists act more in silos. On top of that, the client may also be experiencing the next level of placebo where they subconsciously buy into the process even more due to the nature of the lab experiment and professionals and data and whatnot. Another reason is that lab participants often have less intense PTSD symptoms, or they're asked to focus on distressing memories, but not necessarily traumatic ones. And these are often voluntary students who are a part of these trials. There are also critiques about how the EMDR field has responded to these findings. When early dismantling studies failed to find a difference, EMDR training materials and manuals were updated to emphasize different dosages and variants of bilateral stimulation. When different modes of bilateral stimulation, like tapping, showed similar outcomes, tapping became framed as a legitimate variant of EMDR rather than a distinct control that proves otherwise. Obviously, if the unique feature of EMDR can be expanded to include other things, then it's not unique. I once talked to a fellow therapist who had just returned from an EMDR conference, and they were genuinely convinced that walking was now an EMDR intervention. Walking. Why? Well, because it involves alternating bilateral movement, right? And you're right, that sounds odd. At some point, if everything counts, like tapping or sounds or walking, then really nothing is being tested. Critics rightfully argue that this looks like moving the goalpost, and I would say it is. That's a very serious critique. The field of psychology advances by testing hypotheses with a willingness to accept inconvenient answers. If the specific mechanism you name is central to your modality, if it fails repeated tests, the honest response is to revise the theory rather than to redefine the terms so your treatment still fits the original claim. That is fairly questionable, if not shady, in my opinion. If you do a deeper dive into EMDR and its founder, Shapiro, there's actually more questionableness to it. I highly recommend the YouTube video from Neural Transmissions. The video is titled A Hard Look at EMDR and Its Unscrupulous Founder. Of course, I'll have a link in the description along with all the sources that I'm pulling from, but not naming in the episode. As I said before, EMDR is supported by evidence, but the evidence has weaknesses, and there's actually more weaknesses I'll list for you. One major concern is allegiance bias. Many EMDR studies are conducted by clinicians who train in and promote EMDR. Studies run by invested parties tend to produce larger effect sizes, more benefit basically, across psychotherapy research. Now that doesn't automatically invalidate things, but it does mean we need to spend more time on independent replications. Also, sample sizes in many trials have been small, which has weakened statistical power and increases uncertainty. Publication bias is always a concern. Negative or null trials are less likely to be published, which inflates what we think is true about EMDR. So these shortcomings, by the way, they're not just an EMDR issue. Psychotherapy studies, in large part, have major problems such as these. Let's do a little thought experiment to illustrate the overall point. Imagine you were coming to me for therapy because I have a revolutionary new method that has shown great results. I help my clients to process their trauma through telling the trauma narrative, the story. But while they do so, they flex and curl their toes and then they release it. It's called toe curling, desensitization, and reprocessing, or TCDR. At first, you think, Justin, you want me to tell you my traumas, the most horrific things in my life, while curling my toes? It seems weird to you. But I assure you that toe curling creates a rhythmic motor pattern that occupies a portion of working memory and thereby reduces the vividness of the traumatic image while you hold it in mind. TCDR still sounds silly to you, but the reasoning I give you sounds fancy enough, and you can't argue with the studies that say there's benefit, and everyone's talking about it. And Bessel van der Kolk raves about it in The Body Keeps the Score, a book you love. So you cautiously agree to meet with me, desperate for change. When we meet, I don't just ask you to clench and release your toes, obviously. I also greet you at the door and I invite you in. The office is calming with natural greens and blues. It's silent and there's a nice view out the window which overlooks the water. We smile together, we chit-chat a bit, talk about the weather. I learn more about you and assess your needs. We make a treatment plan together. Basic therapy stuff, right? Now, as you're ready, you tell me your traumatic life context, yes, while curling and releasing your toes. And it's not pleasant to talk about this stuff, but you're okay. You recover. We process what happened. You get homework, and we meet again the following week. I suspect that TCDR would be just as effective as EMDR. Not because of the toe curling, which is obviously not necessary, right? But even though it might sound plausible, but because of the common factors of therapy. The toe curling is dressing, it's cosmetic, and ultimately unnecessary. So what's the practical takeaway? First, EMDR is an evidence-based option. If you have found a clinician who uses EMDR and you feel safe and supported and you're making progress, that is meaningful and that's positive. I'm happy for you. Second, many of the helpful components of EMDR are not unique to EMDR. Actually, the majority of it. Safety building, co-regulation, gradual exposure, cognitive change, and more show up in effective therapies across the board. You do not need to have EMDR to get those ingredients. Third, the central signature of EMDR, bilateral stimulation, especially with eyes, is probably not essential for the bulk of its clinical effects. The research suggests it may add a small effect in tightly controlled lab conditions, but in the messy reality of therapy, it is not the engine driving recovery. That conclusion should be liberating more than upsetting, or maybe for clients more so, potential clients. Healing trauma is not locked behind a single ritual or a single technique. If you're worried that you missed something because you didn't have EMDR, or you're choosing between therapists and the only option is someone who practices prolonged exposure or cognitive reprocessing therapy, that's okay. Or something else, that's okay. Focus instead on the practical markers of good care. A therapist who prioritizes safety, who can help you regulate, who builds a steady alliance, who introduces the work slowly, and who helps you make meaning of change. Those pieces are essential and more. As a therapist and coach, I also use gradual exposure to discomfort. But instead of asking clients to tell me trauma narratives, we focus on emotions that are typically difficult to acknowledge, difficult to pay attention to feel. But they're there anyway, so we got to pay attention to them. We pay attention within or slightly past the edge of what the client can tolerate, and then we recover. Once back at a baseline, we can try again if they would like and if they're ready to. Over time, typically within a single session, these emotions become much more tolerable. Not cured, I'm not saying that, but much more tolerable. And we can then target more difficult ones as they are ready, as their capacity allows. But personally, I don't think that there's a need to add anything else to the mix, like eye movements and tapping and sounds and no, not even clenched toesies, but you can if you want. In fact, I believe I can even step back from the equation for many potential clients who don't have a severe level of dysregulation. I'm not saying that. And that these potential clients with mild and moderate activation that they can learn and practice their own self-regulation skills through the Unstucking Academy. Well, for the most part, I'll step back. In the academy, you'll still learn from me. You'll meet with me during live Q&As and nervous system capacity builder live events and more. You'll listen to pre-recorded meditations from me to help you build up your skills, but the practices are ultimately up to you. It's still up to you to show up. Still up to you to learn and to apply. The small community is incredible and has lots of wisdom within it. And all Unstucking Academy co-regulation tier students can join the many live cohorts and live events throughout their subscription, like Safety Simplified and Self-Regulation Simplified. You can learn more about the Unstucking Academy, by the way, at stucknotbroken.com/unstuckingacademy. Again, stucknotbroken.com/unstuckingacademy. So to wrap up, EMDR gives clinicians and clients a structured path to change, toward change. Bilateral stimulation is part of that path, but probably not the sole reason the path exists, and probably not even a necessary piece of it. That puts power back into your hands as a potential therapy client. You have lots of choices. Healing is not a trick, it's not a gimmick, it's not a hack. It's a reliable set of practices built on top of safety and all those wonderful co-regulative pieces of therapy that all styles should have in common. Thank you so much for spending time with me here on Stuck Not Broken. Bye.